And please join me in welcoming Lee Fox.
Welcome, and I just wanted to welcome all of the Foxes who are here, and once you are a fellow, you're always a Fox. So, on top of which, as I'm sitting listening to the conversation, it does of course strike me that we are sitting in a land, with the exception of Native Americans, of immigrants or migrants, or however you'd like to refer to us. I was asked to introduce the Baroness, who I now understand would prefer to be referred to as Emma. And her accomplishments and her life are, on paper, are fascinating. Let me say a few brief things. She was a member of the House of Commons from 1987 to 1997, when she was appointed to be a life peer in the House of Lords by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. And then she was elected to the European Parliament twice for 2 5-year terms, ending for the second time in 2004. She also served as a member of the British delegation to the Parliament of the Council of Europe until 2014, where she was a member of the Monitoring Committee and worked on Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey. I could go on. Two other, for me, very fascinating things about Emma. She founded an organization called Amar, the Amar Foundation, in 1991, Amar being an acronym for Assisting Marsh Arabs and Refugees. Their primary point of focus is in Iraq. She chairs the Amar International Charitable Foundation based in Washington and its sister organizations in London, Iraq, and Lebanon. As a longtime reader and literary person, the other fascinating thing about Emma is that she is the founder president of the Kane Prize for African Writing, a founder member of the Booker Prize Foundation, and of the Booker Prize for Russian Fiction, and a prize committee member of the Arab Gulf Program for United Nations Development Organizations. It is with great pleasure that the Fox International Fellowship, Yale University, and the Fox family welcome Baroness Emma Nicholson.
Thank you very much for your kind and very generous introduction. And thank you all for inviting me today to join you. A very particular thanks to Alice Delana, who introduced me here. And of course, I was introduced to Alice last summer by my very, very good friend, Missy Casals-Hanby here, who's known Alice since Missy was a child. So thank you both very much indeed. And thank you, Ben, for allowing me to join this very eminent gathering. And thanks to all of you who've been speaking for the enormously important things that you've been saying. It is a particular pleasure, therefore, to be able to gather the threads of what you've been speaking about this afternoon in a final gathering of thoughts, and perhaps to offer you some ideas and some suggestions as to how we might progress this enormous problem. The problem of our fellow citizens who are maybe homeless, hungry, tortured, tormented, deficient in the normal things of life, and who are labelled by the rest of us as refugees. This conference is therefore one of very high value indeed. I enjoyed immensely and wanted to discuss a very great deal more some of the particular points that some of our speakers made. Esteban, for example, on borders. Well, borders are hugely important and utterly frustrating. And for me, borders in this context particularly reflect the lack of legal status of what we grandly call IDPs, internally displaced people, As you and I know, there is no IDP protection at all obtainable under the UN rules. Indeed, there's only one convention, I think, that covers IDPs, and that is the Contracting Parties Convention, the Berne Convention. And the contracting parties who signed that convention are unlikely to be the governments that force some of their citizens to become internally displaced. So it's a bit of a non-starter. That's what borders means to me. So I very much welcomed Esteban's discussion on borders. It's a discussion that should come right out in the open. And at the moment, when borders seem to be uniquely fragile, the nation state, the United Nations, the global order, all depends upon borders. And borders are now turning out to be more flexible than they have been for some considerable time. Dr. Zinioglu, a fascinating talk. I spent a decade in the House of Commons, and then, as Mrs. Fox said, a decade in the European Parliament. As Vice President of the Foreign Policy Committee, I was responsible for a big chunk of enlargement. I worked for a while on Turkey, not particularly for the long haul, because I then came back to work in the House of Lords and to work in the European, the Convention, into the European Parliament, the Parliament of the Council of Europe, the rather larger concept of which the European Union is only the very wealthy end. But I worked really hard on involvement of member states. Would they or would they not allow other applicant countries to come? My particular country was Romania. And there we have a big border issue. If Romania had not joined the European Union, that eastern border, that enormously eastern border, would probably have gone east again, conceptually, and would now be controlled by Russia. Incidentally, the most difficult job I do of all the tasks I have at the moment is to be chairman of the Russian Booker Prize, the Booker Prize for Russian fiction, Bucharesti. And it's difficult because I don't speak Russian. And it's really hard because Mr. Putin doesn't like us. And it makes me think we must be doing the right thing. So I really enjoyed the extraordinarily competent points put forward from the Turkish perspective largely about the accession process. The only thing I wouldn't agree with, it's terribly easy to think that the accession rules have altered. As a matter of fact, they haven't. We froze them. It's just that the more they're unveiled to an applicant country, the more difficult they seem to be. But we deliberately froze them. Otherwise, they would have gone on and on and on changing, and the prize would forever be out of reach. That's the only point at which I found I disagreed. I would love to have a chatter about that. Sarah Silverstein, my goodness me, she rang all the bells for me and for my colleagues here from the Amar Foundation, US and UK. Chris Stroud, Missy Cassels-Hamby, Rob, who's somewhere around from the UK. Why? Because she talked about the new human right to well-being. As somebody absolutely committed to the World Health Organization key slogan of health for all, I will be able to show you in a minute or two how some of us are implementing this on the ground through special professionals, capacity building, institution building professionals on the ground inside the Federal Republic of Iraq, and to a lesser extent, because of financial weakness, in Lebanon, and how we managed it in the very, very tough terrain of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So absolutely, my goodness me, how much I liked your concept, which I agree with fully, that the Eastern European doctors, mainly Jewish, I think, they are the ones who built the concept of the European health that so many of us in Western Europe enjoy today. Dr. Amir, Dr. Charisma Almir, her topic that I loved of her, which I'd love to talk about, is child refugees. I've worked a huge amount in the last 15 years on child trafficking particularly, and I'm sure that her knowledge would be absolutely invaluable. A very difficult subject, of course, particularly in countries that haven't signed or ratified the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, because that's such an overarching convention. and somehow it hasn't completed its journey, and it won't do so until perhaps the USA felt like endorsing it. But that's an incredibly important convention because it covers the child's life from start to finish. And when you look at the plight of migrants, when you look at the plight of refugees and IDPs, the people who suffer most of all, I think, are the children. And it's their rights that get degraded, dissolved, destroyed, and forgotten. And therefore, I think the rights of the child should come up front. Alexandra Alonso and Benjamin Nicholson on migrant deaths, visibility, and responsibility. They reminded me of John Donne, never ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for me. Every man's death is the same as mine or a member of my family. A hugely important topic that is barely touched on normally, and I thank you very much indeed for bringing this to light for us today. I was also amused to see that I must pick up the book by Benjamin on South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I actually gave evidence in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a tough thing to do, really difficult, because I was giving evidence against Mrs. Winnie Mandela on the death of Stompie. And you can imagine that I wasn't the most popular person in the room, certainly from her, when I actually gave that evidence. I very much wished I hadn't got it, but having got it and I was summoned by the Truth and Reconciliation, I gave my evidence. But it was really a tough haul. And Candy Bloom, what an enormously important topic you raised. Very, very, very hard one indeed. Because on the one hand, a government and a parliament, and I'm a parliamentarian, we have the responsibility, primary responsibility, for the health and safety of our own citizens and those who already live within our borders, those who have been allowed to come in, if you like it, or have just arrived. And you have to take that first. You must take that first. And that's very difficult as individuals for us politicians, because obviously we want to help everybody. Most of us go into politics for a perfectly reasonable reason, and we want to help everyone. But if you bring in huge chunks of people of a different nationality, or many different nationalities and different faiths, and that's a very important point, the clash of cultures may ruin the stability of your own citizens. So it's quite a hard balance to strike. Are you going to help the stranger? Are you going to protect your own citizens? How do you manage to do both? And that's why I enjoyed listening to her so much. Thank you all, therefore, for what you said. And let me now try to draw one or two threads together. Overall, I would say that the topic of human safety and migration, which we've been exploring this afternoon, I'd like to suggest that we haven't quite pulled together our focus on what we mean by human safety. It's very easy to think of it as security. Essential. Most humans want a peaceful life so that they can develop their own talents, raise families, look after others, and have a future. I tend to think of human safety as meaning much more than personal hygiene, water, human sewage disposal. I move it on, as you can see, to public health, which I see a key essential, which brings calmness, stability, and hope. Mothers can have healthy babies, whereas if you look at Iraq, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at a huge number of countries where there are migration flows, you find that the death on birth rate of infants, the infant mortality, and the maternal mortality shoots up. It's simply horrific. So health is key. Public health is absolutely key, in my mind, for human safety. Obviously, I think strongly, too, that a human is more than just a machine which needs feeding and watering and giving a bit of help. We must have learning, so that means education. I ask you why the United Nations doesn't have a responsibility in camps, for example, or for migrants. Why doesn't it have a responsibility for education, for all of the hundreds of millions of children who are in refugee camps? And don't let's run away with the idea that a refugee camp is short-term. Current statistics show us that the average life of a refugee in a refugee camp, the duration of their life in a refugee camp, rather, is 11 years. Well, if the child arrives at 7, leaves at 18, and it has no education, what have you done? You've delivered to somebody a half-life, a life in the shadows, nothing really that can give them an opportunity to be themselves. So I ask you why the United Nations doesn't have the responsibility for giving education. And I think that's also important for training and occupation. People have minds, they have thoughts, they have futures. And if they don't have possibilities for training, for learning, for tertiary in some way or another, for vocational training, how are they going to have a life at all for the 11 years in refugee camps and afterwards? Because hopefully they will still be alive. So for me, human safety also involves higher education, vocational training, futures, and then it should involve the capability to find our own faith, to be able to worship in a refugee camp. You tell me, when you go to a big refugee camp of 82,000 people, as I did recently, where is the possibility for these people of different faiths to practice their faith? A hugely important thing that isn't thought of in refugee and migrant situations in terms of populations, let alone the squatters. We've forgotten the huge number of squatters. What does all this mean in practical terms? Well, my feeling about that is that there's a vast number of practical things that can be done, as well as some quite serious and significant political ones. I've mentioned one or two of the political ones already. I'll come back to those in a second or two. But I also chair at the moment, just completing my task, the Committee for Sexual Offences and Violence, the Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative. And this is in conflict zones. And the statistics we've dug up as a committee in the House of Lords show us something extremely unpalatable, but which I think we knew already, that in camps, people are uniquely vulnerable to sexual offences, uniquely vulnerable. Partly because the United Nations doesn't protect camps. It doesn't have a protection. It takes responsibility for providing the food, for providing the water, very poor responsibility from what I've seen for delivering its obligations to provide hygiene and human waste disposal. Much of the ill health that I've seen in camps comes from appalling gut diseases because the United Nations, UNHCR, hasn't fulfilled its obligation to provide human sewage disposal, which shows you the really basic gaps that are happening for the many millions of refugees. The IDPs are in an even worse state because the United Nations has no responsibility for them at all. So the other huge issue on human safety in refugee camps and IDP situations is, of course, people trafficking. Huge volumes of people trafficking. When a victim gets out, perhaps at the moment from Mosul, they're absolutely vulnerable now to people traffickers. They can be sold and sold and sold again. So they escape from one terrible situation, expecting safety. And what do they get? They get another form of gross exploitation. Acute vulnerability of refugees, IDPs and squatters is something we need to build into our thinking. And you've done it with the title, but I ask you to think about how we should implement that body of potential which would bring a human being to life in the real sense of the word that I've just identified. Well, as a politician, I know that it takes forever almost to get a law in place, and sometimes they're very, very difficult to implement. It doesn't mean to say you mustn't get the law in place. It's absolutely essential. I've identified, for example, the weak state, legally, of IDPs. They have no protection. But on top of that, many nations that have refugees in them were never signatories of the Refugee Convention in the first place. It was nothing to do with them. This was a European reaction to a European problem. So the fact that, for example, Iraq and Syria were never signatories, the fact that they don't belong to the ICC, for example, we can't expect everybody to have signed all these things, but the UN still goes by its old rule book. So it says we can't help Syrian refugees in Iraq officially because, after all, they're not refugees because Iraq never signed the Refugee Convention. And we can't help the Mosul and Nineveh Plain migrants, wherever they are in Iraq, because we don't deal with IDPs. And no, we can't bring any genocide charge against anybody in ICC because Iraq, for example, doesn't belong to the ICC. I really think, dear colleagues and friends, that we need a total renewal of the way in which we have our supposed rules-based world. It's fine for us. It isn't fine for those who are in greatest need, on whose plight we've touched today. As a politician, therefore, I work on a daily basis on these important matters. I'm lucky to have the opportunity to do so. But I also think it's crucially important to do something practical. And that's where I turn to tell you a little bit about the Amar International Charitable Foundation and the concepts that we've identified which make things work. What do I mean by work? I mean that in this small charity with very little funding, we have some principles that are actually hugely effective. First of all, we think of the concept of permanency. We are disinterested in a short, sharp shock, in and out thing. We're only interested in helping if we can possibly build something that is permanent. And that's where Mrs. Silverstein, Sarah, commented on the need for building up the health. And that's exactly what we've been doing now, building up the health systems in Iraq, not just delivering help, but building up the systems. And we want those systems to be permanent, because it isn't a permanent health system in Iraq. There's really no health system at all, basically. So we've been assisting, demonstrating, pioneering the building of a health system in the Federal Republic of Iraq. And for us, that means permanency. So what does that mean? What are the bits and pieces that create that permanency? One of the key things is affordability. If you've got enough money, you can fly in a Rolls-Royce to Haiti after the earthquake, and then you fly it out again when you get bored and you take it somewhere else. Long, slow, hard work on the ground would have used the funding that was given to Haiti that would have left Haiti in a completely different state. In fact, what happened with all that money is that somehow it just didn't go for permanent solutions. It didn't go for health and education in the way that lasted. And as we know from all the reports that have come out, Haiti was no better at the end than it was at the beginning. Well, I think that's because of a lack of vision of permanency. Affordability is a crucial part of permanency. You have to create a system that in the long run will be affordable by the local people themselves. Because you're not going to be there forever, you don't belong, you're not a citizen, what are you doing there anyway? So it's got to be the people themselves who can both put it together, run it, and actually afford it. So affordability is very important. We demonstrate that in our daily life in the Amar Foundation because we run at less than 10% overhead costs. And as one of the US generals said in Baghdad when we were working there in the mid-2000s, we stretch the dollar so far that it actually becomes invisible. Indeed, I think it was the auditor of all the funding spent in Iraq who accepted the point from the US military that a dollar spent through the Amar Foundation is the best spent dollar in the entire reconstruction process of Iraq. That entirely comes from our concept of permanency, which must mean affordability. Stretch that dollar the furthest you possibly can. But that only works if you're going for the highest standards. People in need have greater need than maybe you and I. They have greater need of health because they have more wrong with them. They have greater need of education. Perhaps they've never even been taught to read and write. So their needs are vast. That means they've got to be met to the top professional level. And how do you do that? Well, it's very easy, really. You go to the WHO, the World Health Organization, where you'll get all the standards in the world. And you go to the UNESCO, where again, you go to all the teaching, the science, and the creative arts standards. So that's what the professionals are looking for all the time in our team. So highest possible standards, lowest possible costs. And that's the nice game we play every year, every day. Push up the standards, pull down the costs, because that means you're offering something locally that people will utterly welcome. Then we work hard to make absolutely sure that we're in the community. And I don't just mean, as it were, in the village or in the tribe. People's governments are our own governments. We have to work with governments, work with the health ministry, teach the health ministry, learn from the health ministry, work with the education ministry. I think I've signed 20 different agreements with 20 different ministries in Baghdad and more in Erbil, and we do them all the time because it's utterly vital. These are the people's own governments. Who are you to come in and say, I don't like your government and I won't work with you? A huge number of international interventionists with the best meaning and will in the world, that's exactly what they do. That's not your judgment. Be more humble. So we work very closely and we bring the standards. Who does this? Who delivers this? It's certainly not me as a politician, and it's not my colleagues on the US board or the British board, nor our tiny, tiny staff. We have 1.5 offices in Washington, 1.5 rooms, and 2.5 rooms, I think it is, in London. That's why the costs are so low. Well, the answer is that in every single place in the globe, you will find wonderful, super people. You'll find humans as talented as you and me, and probably 50 times more talented. They just haven't had the opportunity, maybe organizational opportunities. You have to have a structure for doctors and teachers to work in. You have to have some buildings. But even more than that, they may not have had the opportunity for the training. So passing on the knowledge and all the rest of it, absolutely critical. So really, the Amar Foundation is a training hub of no mean proportions. And then again, you're going to want to involve everybody in this whole thing. So you want the youngest, the oldest, you want the meanest in terms of economy, as well as the most wealthy. Health for all. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. Education for all, jobs for all, futures for everybody. So you want to work at all layers of society. I tend to work quite a lot with the ministers, for example, because I'm a politician. Others work with different levels of society. We're particularly proud of the way in which we bring young girls involved. We teach them the basics of health, and each woman health volunteer, as we call them, rather like women health visitors. Hopefully we can get that much further with them if we can find some more money. We teach them, and each of them adopts 50 families, visits those same 50 families every month with the new monthly messages and teaching. And that material comes from the World Health Organization and is passed and cleared by the Ministry of Health in Baghdad or Erbil and the Ministries of Education. So blend and work with absolutely everybody. And that's where the quality of the staff and the volunteers is just inspirational. And we've managed to do this through the strength of those unique individuals. And in every single society, those individuals are there. And it takes time to find them. It takes time to persuade them. It takes time to create the structure in which they can blossom. But in the end of the day, they're the people who make all this work. And perhaps the great excitement for me is to see the fruits of all of this labor. It was not easy at all to work in refugee camps in Iran, particularly for a British politician connected with the USA. total curtains, absolutely unwanted in every shape or form, undoubtedly a spy, probably bringing Zionist money in, which has been cycled through Washington and out through London again. I mean, a lot of crazy thoughts. So have to get on with it because of all the people. And again, with the Afghan refugees and a little bit inside Afghanistan itself, and now inside Iraq, and since 1996 in Lebanon. We're waiting to get visas to go into Yemen, exactly where we ought to be. But you can find magnificent people at all levels of society. And that's exactly the message that I'd like you to think about when we're assessing this enormous problem. The highest number of people moving, as one of our speakers said today, since the Second World War. Hundreds of them, even worse than hundreds, dying on the move. Many, many thousands of children who've lost their parents or whose parents have sent them away in the hope of a better future, which they're not going to get. And here we are with the European Union tangling with Turkey, with an incredibly impossible set of so-called deals which can't be fulfilled. And it really is a very miserable situation indeed. At the back of all of this, we have ISIL, we have Al-Qaeda, we have Boko Haram, we have some particularly poisonous organizations globally at the moment. I think at the moment our big priority in the Amar Foundation is the refugee camps that hold about 150,000 Yazidi refugees who are steadily being deliberately wiped out for good and all. So I would ask you, returning to all of your comments today, to think hard that we need two things. We need to tackle the big issue of the United Nations responsibilities. We need to tackle the big issues of governmental responsibilities. You're making huge progress on that from what you've been talking about today, but we're not there yet. We need action, not just some discussions. We've got to get to grips with all of this, persuade the UN, persuade the governments. We need a new world order, if only for the sake of refugees and IDPs. It is intolerable that IDPs are not protected by the United Nations. It is even more intolerable that the refugees sitting in refugee camps don't qualify as refugees because somebody in a nation that maybe didn't yet exist in 1951 didn't sign a bit of paper that was in Geneva. This is not acceptable. We have to work on this very hard, more than hard, because we've got to achieve. But then at the bottom line are the people themselves. And that's where I would really ask you to get involved. You can make the difference to many, many millions of people by adopting the simple principles I've identified. If you look at the few bits of paper we give you, they're very few because we don't spend any money, you will see exactly those principles in practice. And at the moment, the Amar Foundation, to give you the final point on this and why it works, I think we've got an income of about $4, maybe $5 million utterly maximum. We have 1 million patients, 250,000, I think it is, pupils of all different ages and types, and a whole load of others that we're helping and assisting in different ways, including with a big religious tolerance program. All of this for that tiny sum of money. And those 1 million people would get no health care at all without us. So with that small bit of money, just a few of us doing things, think what you could do if you followed exactly the same pattern, each and every one of you. It's a big job ahead. You've identified it. I congratulate you. But the time for action is well upon us, and I urge you to do a great deal to help. Thank you all very much. We've got time for some questions, I think. Rob, come and help. I'm asking Rob to come and help because I was born deaf. And it's a very helpful attribute for a politician. In fact, I can genuinely say I didn't hear the questions. It's very rather nice. Who wants to ask a few questions? And even nicer if you come up to the front for me.
Gilad has the mic as well.
think we've got one or two people. Great. Oh, thank you, Rob. Do you want to put it here?
Yeah.
That's better. Well done. Okay.
Thank you, Baroness. We really appreciate you being here, needless to say. I'm just wondering about the UK and how your opinion about what the reaction of the UK government has been to the current crisis. I know that, of course, you're in the throes of determining whether or not, when I say you, I mean the country is in the throes of determining whether or not to stay in the EU, and I know that's the primary
Refugee camps.
topic of conversation, I assume, over there. But it seems that the UK has adopted a back seat. You don't hear too much about their opinions about the refugee crisis as compared to other countries. And obviously one of the reasons is they're not as directly affected. They're far away, and also because it's a hot political issue which they probably don't want to talk about, given the fact that I'm talking about the government. So my question to you is, could you give us an idea as to what public opinion is and what you think the government's attitude should be, as opposed to what they have expressed?
The UK has a net migration inwards at the moment of 2 million a year. And we're about, I think, the 5th or 6th most populated patch of land in the globe. And this enormous net immigration is putting incredible pressure on our public health and on the school systems. For example, in London, we have 150 languages now. And if the police have to issue a warning, there's a bomb or something, which does happen, they have to translate it immediately to 150 different languages. A lot of those languages are not English or not English-based. In primary schools in inner London alone, we have 108 home languages. So the pressure on the educational system is acute. We also have free health, and therefore that's a pretty big pressure with a net immigration of these enormous figures at the moment. I don't think the UK is not doing a task in that sense. We have, the most diverse population of the globe, and a lot of them come in. It's not, as it were, by invitation. And I think we're actually doing quite well, funnily enough. I would like to have a lot more Iraqi and Syrian immigrants, and the Prime Minister has bent a bit on that, but public opinion is against it, simply because of this enormous net immigration already, and the fact that when I was knocking on doors, for example, in the Scottish referendum, I went up to East Glasgow, which was the toughest nut to crack in terms of keeping Scotland and England together. I'm half Scottish. And their whole complaint was they couldn't get their kids into primary school any longer because they were actually full of the immigrants. So you have to be careful. You've got a population. We have a huge volume of net immigration at the moment, and I can understand why the population is not too keen to open the door even more, although I'd like it to happen myself. Incidentally, I apologise for East Glasgow. We sent you Donald Trump from there. And Mr. Bernie Grant has a foot in Oxford University, where I think his brother is a Don. And he came from Leicestershire. So we have a lot to answer for. They were both migrants, immigrants.
Can you describe how the political will come together to move the UN on these various issues that you described?
They're not going to do it unless we all talk about it. It's a whole lot easier not to tamper with the UN. The UN is a very, very difficult animal indeed. And it's a very, very hard thing to get anything through that's sensible. For example, I got some sort of a message from somebody in the House of Lords who's Jewish, to say that this last week the UN has declared, with 5 different resolutions all passed, that Israel is the worst human rights abuser in the globe, in which they ignored ISIL, they ignored North Korea, Saudi Arabia. So the UN is very difficult indeed to get sensible decisions, if I could put it that way around. The only way of doing it is to talk, argue, pressurize your own government, other people's governments, the UN itself. And that's what I'm begging you all to do, or nothing will happen. It has to be intelligent people pressure. And then it is just possible, but it's not easy. But we must do it. Come with me to the refugee camps. See that they're not qualified as refugees because of some lack of a signature of somebody who didn't exist in 1951. We have to do it. I urge you to get moving. Governments have the seats in the UN. The diplomats represent the governments for most of the time. There are 2 key elements to aim at. The foreign ministries and the ministers, the foreign ministers and the prime ministers. Those are the only people who will make any progress at all. And then there are, of course, a huge amount of NGOs that have sort of listening rights or status rights. What are they doing with them? Just putting it on their own bits of paper so they seem grand? Push the NGOs. What are they there for? They're spending money going there. They should do something. They shouldn't be sitting there. So galvanize people. Be political with a small p. It doesn't need to be party political. You're asking for human rights, which everybody has given to them theoretically, and this whole cluster of people we've been discussing don't get. So push, lobby, talk, scream, shout, have meetings. Anything is possible with the power of the people.
Thank you very much for those comments. And I want to come back to this question about the different institutions that you've been talking about who we want to try and influence in some way. We've heard about the United Nations and the challenges that faces. And you've also discussed about the UK as well and the influence that the UK has had on these challenges. I'm curious what you're thinking about the European Union, given we've had discussions today about the complicated ways in which the EU both addresses these challenges and also causes challenges. That's the first part of my question. How would you think of the EU as a place to mobilize support compared to the UN? And then how does that answer then affect the deliberations the UK is having right now about its relationship with the EU?
The European Union about 5 years ago obtained a legal personality. That was a terrific step forward for the EU because it means that the European Union can now be represented in the UN, for example, and in all other official bodies. Before then, the EU could only be represented by its member states. Well, there are now 27 member states and more in the offing. But nonetheless, that's not nearly as strong as having a legal personality itself. This is a novel thing, and therefore this is something that can now be used. And the EU isn't on the Security Council, but the EU has 2 key members on the Security Council. It's France and Britain. And in the rotating larger Security Council, many members sit on it. So the EU is an absolute prime target for this. And the EU is a good and beneficent institution. It's highly irritating in some ways, and at the moment it's annoying the British people, which is fair. But nonetheless, it is a force for good. It is a force for very good indeed. So approach the EU, whether or not your country is a member, whether you're an applicant country, whether you just have with your country, you just have a partnership association with the EU. The EU is there to be used. And if it's encouraged, it will do huge amount. Why is the British public grumpy with the European Union at the moment? That's very easy. It's because the shape and flavour and mission of the EU and its institutions have changed dramatically since we decided to join. And we have a huge volume of our legislation that comes direct from Brussels at the moment, and we don't really want it, and it's not our type of legislation. We don't have Roman law, we have common law. All this force feeding of Roman law into our system is destroying many of our freedoms. Britain is also the second biggest net contributor since the EU began. And I think when I tell you that the third biggest is Malta, you'll see that basically the EU show is kept on the road by Germany and the UK. Well, the British people are a bit sick of having all this legislation forced down their throats that they don't want, that most other countries don't bother to implement, but sadly we do, because we obey the law. We're deemed, by the way, in recent surveys to be the most honest nation in the globe, and that means we do obey the law. So people are just feeling fed up. They're rather out and enjoy being free again. So that's where it is. We've got a referendum on the 23rd of June.
Nancy Ruther, and so I'm struck in the press by the Syrian, the Middle Eastern refugees flooding into Europe and the African refugees flooding. You probably know the press would tell you that there are many, many more in the Middle East. Certainly coverage is much bigger walking across Europe. But it seems to me that the color of the skin is quite a difference too. There were a black child who had washed up on I'm struck by the different reactions.
It's certainly not in the UK. For example, every single year, whatever we seem to do, we have 4,000 unaccompanied children for whom we can't trace the parents. Their parents have put them on an aeroplane and they've just arrived. And somehow the aeroplane has accepted them. They've been slipped under the arm of another grown-up or something. And most of those children come from West Africa. The largest number of them come from Nigeria. And they get no different treatment from anybody else in that sense. None at all. The colour of the skin is irrelevant in the UK. The problem with the North African migrants, they're not really North African. They come from a bit further south, is that they're economic migrants. And that's difficult because of the enormous net influx that I identified, certainly in the UK. And when I was in Brussels as a European parliamentarian for a decade, I sat for a while on the Finance Committee. And the huge, huge, huge sums of money that we set aside to spend in North Africa in order to assist people to build businesses, to have education, to have a life in very unprepossessing circumstances. I mean, the notes just fell off the bottom of the checks, as it were. Vast sums of money. And we worked really hard with people over there to build everything up and all the rest of it, and it didn't work. People really don't want to stay there. They want to come to Europe. And that's very difficult indeed, really difficult. They're economic migrants. They're mainly, and I haven't identified this myself physically, personally. I haven't visited, for example, the island of Lesbos to have a look. My understanding is most of them are single young men, and that they're looking for work. Well, all of us want work, but it is hard when this enormous influx from North Africa comes. And North Africa's on the march, Sub-Saharan Africa's on the march, and they want Europe. And that's a harsh thing to do for the resident populations. It is the resident populations that governments and parliaments have to protect first of all. That's our job. So certainly in Britain the colour of the skin is an irrelevancy, total irrelevancy. And if you come and have a look in London, you'll see. And even our enemies arrive. I mean, the great enemy of England Britain is always France. And yet we've got the largest influx of French migrants in the globe. We've got more French in South Kensington than I think they've almost got in Paris now. They've all run away from President Hollande. And the result of that is we've also got the best croissant and the best coffee almost in the whole of Europe now. Come and have a look. And enmity is an odd thing, and the European Union has been a huge force for good in dissolving enmity. The other day I happened to be at a French embassy shortly after the ghastly thing that happened with all that loss of life, and it was in Australia where I was speaking, and I went to his reception, and I took with me a little gold button. Luckily I brought one with me, a really nice one, proper gold, from the House of Lords, and I went up to the ambassador and I pinned it on him. And he embraced me with tears in his eyes, and he said, "You British, you English, you British, you're our enemy. Yet when something really bad comes to us, you come to us immediately. We know we can rely on you. Come first and you leave last." And the European Union has allowed that to happen. The European Union is a force for good. It cares deeply about refugees and migrancy, but we need to use them.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to have Alice Lynn come up and just say thank you and wrap up our wonderful.
My name is Alice Delana. I am by marriage a member of the Fox Fellowship, so I'm a Fox in a manner of speaking. I'm also a former teacher of Missy Cassels-Hamby, who is one of the great instigators of this wonderful event today. And wonderful seems like a trivializing word. It seems too glib, it seems too easy. And another thing that seems too easy is for me to confess to you that my Facebook page is a picture of Emma and me taken last summer. A trivial point, but a point that suggests that we have had a wonderful time together, speaking not about these issues as much as many other issues that sometimes include the word Trump. I say thank you to Baroness Nicholson, to Emma, for what she has said to us. I've just said some trivial things, but what she said included words like tackle and galvanize and enmity and obligation, and she urged us to go forth and to do what we can. And so I thank Emma, and I thank all members of the panels today. I thank us all for staying until this hour. And I wish to read one part of a poem that perhaps Emma even judged at one time, since she serves on so many different committees around the world. It's a poem by a very, very young Somali woman born in Kenya, and it's very short. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. That's a poem, as I say, that was written by a young Somali woman, Washan Shear. She will be writing many more poems, and so far, they've all been about fleeing for her life. But the last word of that poem is stay. I'd like to say thank you again to Emma and to Ben and to all of us here for staying. I personally could stay all night and listen to Emma Nicholson. And so thank you very much. I'm sure Ben would like me to stop, and so I will with those thanks. Thank you.